Right. So welcome committee members, liaisons, and members of the public to the Partnership Grants Committee meeting. Thank you for joining us. We're using Zoom with the goal to foster a more inclusive environment and effective meeting. If you'd like to comment during the meeting, please type "I have a comment" or "I have a question" in the chat, and a message will be sent to the host. Alternatively, you can use the raise hand feature. In efforts for transparency for all those joining the public meeting, whether by phone or Zoom, we request that you refrain from having side conversations on chat about the content of the meeting. Again, the chat feature is utilized simply as a tool for you to virtually indicate that you'd like to speak in order to help the chair facilitate the discussion. Going forward, all trust fund commission and committee meetings will be recorded and posted on the State Bar website. And a friendly reminder that this is a video conference, and please be aware of your surroundings behind you. For those, some troubleshooting tips for those using Zoom on a computer. When on mute, holding down the space bar will temporarily unmute you. If you use your phone to dial into this meeting, please be sure your computer's microphone is on mute to avoid audio feedback issues. And then while joining audio via computer is highly recommended. If an individual loses audio, they can call in separately using the Zoom conference number.
Thank you. Can you please take roll?
Sure. Christina Vanarelli.
Here.
Kim Bartleson. Will Bashelli. Eric Iskin.
Here.
Chris Schreiber.
Oh. I know I saw him.
He's waving.
Here I am. Sorry.
Crystal, so somebody is M4C.
I think that's Will Bashelli. Let me
Okay.
see if he can unmute or call that during our sessions. Will, is that you?
Yeah, I logged in the wrong account. Sorry about that.
We
Not a
got you.
problem.
Thank you.
All right, Judge Askell. Justice Murray. Okay. The quorum.
Oh, here comes Will back.
Oh, that's, yeah. That's the Will I know.
Yes.
Do you take roll for staff members as well at this time?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
That's okay.
I'll do the liaisons if any
Okay.
are on the call. Selena Copeland, Bonnie Huff, Melanie Snyder, Christine Ganong, Mark Tony. All right, State Bar staff, Elizabeth Hom,
Present.
Chris McConkey,
Present.
Dan Pasamanik,
Here.
Brady Dewar. I don't know if he was joining today's call. All right, all done with the roll call.
Okay, thank you, Crystal. At this time, members of the public may speak to any item on the agenda. Are there any members of the public on the call who wish to identify themselves? Okay, hearing none, let's move on to the next item on the agenda, which is approved meeting summary and action items for the January 5th, 2021 meeting. Does anybody have any comments on that item? Okay, would somebody like to make a motion to approve the meeting summary and action items? That's Eric. It says Jonathan, but it's Eric. Is there a second? That's, we know who you are.
I'm sorry, was there a second?
I didn't hear one.
I'll second. This is Chris.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? Can we please have a roll call vote?
Sure. Christina Vanarelli,
Yes.
Kim Bartleson, is not here. Will Bashelli,
Yes.
Eric Iskin,
Yes.
Chris Schreiber,
Yes.
all right, motion passes.
Okay, thank you. The next item, and what we're here for, is to discuss the 2022 partnership grant proposals and develop tentative funding recommendations. The staff has been working very hard on this, so I'll turn it over to Crystal.
Thank you, Christina. All right, so So the memo attached for today's meeting kind of outlined some of the updates to the review process. And I just wanted to provide a quick overview before we looked at the rubric scores. So this slide here just has an overview of the timeline thus far for the 2022 grant year. On January 29th, the RFP was released and the application released on Smart Simple. Staff and Judicial Council worked on outreach in February through March. And then that was through the March 18 deadline to submit the partnership grant proposals. March through April, as you all know, were the initial calibration and the subsequent calibration sessions. And today we'll be meeting to discuss the tentative funding recommendations and follow up on any items prior to our June 18th meeting, where we'll finalize those recommendations and also set aside some time to debrief on the full review process for this year. Just a couple of highlights in terms of partnership grant outreach efforts. On February 2nd, staff held a webinar for current grantees, potential applicants, and judicial staff from various self-help centers to walk them through the scoring rubric and other application updates for the 2022 year just to prepare them. We also did targeted outreach to QLSPs who serve rural counties, as well as those who serve counties not currently funded by partnership grants or where courts had expressed interest in potential partnerships. This resulted in about over 50 applications initiated, though the actual application submitted was slightly lower than that. In terms of the proposals received, we received 36 proposals by 26 QLSPs. The total requested amount of funding is $3.094 million. Our estimated available funding, which I was able to confirm yesterday, is $2,580,574. I have a couple of graphs that are also on the memo, but I'll just quickly go over them. The first are this is just a graphical representation of prior years funded across those 36 proposals. As you can see, we do have 5 new proposals, and to note, 8 of those proposals of the pool are projects over 5 years. This is a pie chart as to the funding ranges requested. Just to call out, majority of the proposals are in that $91,000 to $150,000 request range, and we just have a few asking below $49,000. In terms of substantive areas, these are the ones that had overlapping or multiple projects that were going to be addressed. Housing was the most prominent at 12, followed by family and domestic violence. These are the other ones. In case you can't see, consumer finance, guardianship, conservatorship, and income maintenance. These are kind of the one-offs where there was one project that would address this substantive area, and there wasn't necessarily overlap. Juvenile name change and gender marker change, probate of small estates, civil complaints, small claims debt assistance. Just to note, the 5 new projects who have submitted proposals, their areas fall under, there's 2 for housing, 1 is a distribution administration of decedents estates, and then the other one is family and domestic violence. In terms of where the funding would cover, this is another kind of graph, which counties they would fund, just to highlight majority of the projects are in Los Angeles with 9, and I believe Alameda is a close second. So just to kind of get a context as to where and which courthouses these projects would be located. All right. So just to give a high-level overview of the rubric scores before I share the larger spreadsheet, the rubric scores ranged from 54 to 90 points. Generally, higher scores were awarded to newer projects, continuing projects seeking 2nd or 3rd year funding, as well as strong projects serving rural areas. This is generally the spread. We had one project who scored 90. A lot of them, as you can see, are in that 70 to 79 range. And then we had 2 projects below 60 points. Before we get into the spreadsheet, staff wanted to raise a couple of considerations for the committee before we make any tentative funding recommendations, and try to go quickly over this. There's a lot of text in this slide. So the first one is historically partnership grants have been funded between a range of $20,000 to $100,000. Our question is, would the committee consider maintaining this historical funding range for the 2022 grant year? Secondly, historically, the committee has funded all partnership grant proposals. Considering the total amount requested and estimated funding available, if the committee decides to maintain this approach, this could mean significant reductions in grant amounts for certain projects. And then third consideration is that the historical approach for funding recommendations has been a taper decrease over time. For the consideration for the committee, does the committee want to continue this approach or make funding determinations on a case-by-case basis? Since this meeting is slightly different than what we had done, staff made some recommendations, and I'll share that as well in this spreadsheet that I feel like I'm just like alluding to, but just some highlights for this and staff recommendations. The first is to maintain a historical funding range, but potentially increase the top of that range to 120,000. Next, we'd like to utilize the 2021 award allocations as a starting point, especially for the continuing projects, as that has historically been the starting point that the committee has made recommendations. Third is tapered funding for continuing projects, an increment of 5%. This is more of a systematic approach that we felt could be potentially equitable, considering second, third, fourth year projects, etc. Fourth would be utilizing the 70 points mark as a threshold score to determine larger or smaller deductions. And then finally, the largest deductions or potentially no funding would be for the lowest scoring projects or projects with the lowest funding priorities. So I'll pause here to see if there are any questions, or does everyone just want to see the larger spreadsheet?
Yeah.
I had a related question that might fit here, and you can tell me if it should go later.
Sure.
So this is a question related to the instructions. And on some of the items, such as office supplies or technology, they list a limit in the instructions. So equipment purchases under $1,000 for office supplies, or technology under $1,000. And I noted that some of our applicants didn't seem to abide those instructions, or like space, that it shouldn't be paying for funds for renting the court space. And I don't think this will have a major impact on us reaching our goal of bringing those two numbers together, but I am curious whether staff checks those instructions off and makes sure that they have complied. And then if they haven't complied, what our historical response has been. Because some of the projects, could ask for a lot more, and other projects that abided the instructions might not have asked for what they needed. And I'm not sure that it'll have any major impact, but I am curious what's been done in the past and what is currently done on the staff side.
Yeah, so well, in terms of the $1,000 technology cap, I did ask Deanna about it, and we checked our policy. So that amount actually isn't referenced in the policy. I believe that budget language might have been carried over from, I don't know if there's an AL to EF grant. Elizabeth, you can chime in too as to where that amount came from. Given some of the models proposed for this year, I think part of staff's recommendation is a more flexible approach, especially with larger technology budget line items.
I would just add is I don't think that we're constrained by the statute or the understanding with the Judicial Council on that cap. I think that may have been maybe like a historical kind of rollover from past applications, because I think a cap of $1,000 on technology, given the pandemic and our remote environment, would be difficult, for example. So and I think to answer your other question, Will, we do, staff does follow up with all the applicants to make sure that, what they're providing in the applications is responsive to the questions. And I think in many of the working groups, those items were flagged and staff has followed up as appropriate.
Okay, that's fantastic. And I tend to agree with that, where I guess I would strongly advise change, because I'm a person who tends to follow instructions. I would have read that and said, okay, well, we can only ask for $1,000 for technology and for office supplies and for these other items. So I don't want to penalize people in the future. And I hope we can make sure that the instructions match our actual expectations.
I think that this may have to do with capitalism, expenses that can be capitalized, and the idea that any particular technology expense that's over $1,000 should be a capital expense or something along those lines. That's probably an outmoded number. That number should be higher now. But it's not that they shouldn't spend the money, but that if they're going to spend it, at this point, it's an investment, and that would be a per unit item. So if they need to get 5 laptops and they're $700 each, that could go there.
Right. I didn't want to get too far into the minutia, but in terms of evaluating our applicants today, I wanted to make sure that I understood the expectations and that we are clear going forward so that people ask for what they need. Thanks.
Great, thank
I
you.
have a question, Crystal. Back to your recommendations, staff recommendations. I have two questions about those. Can you explain the 5% tapering recommendation? I'm not sure I understand how that would work. And then that's one question. And the other one is the threshold of 70. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that.
Yeah,
So those two things.
Yeah, so the best way I think to show that is in this larger spreadsheet, which I'll share my screen now. Just a warning, there's a lot of columns, so I hope everyone's screens are large enough to take a look. Okay, so I'll walk through the spreadsheet first, and then Eric, I'll respond to your questions as well to show you like where that was, how we did the tapering on the staff recommendations end. So, just starting out from the top, you have the total amount requested, the total amount available, that 2580574 number, and the 2021 award just for reference. Organization, project title, column after years funded. I have a high level results from the rubric scores from those main categories. I've also included the total project budget as indicated on the application and what % of the partnership grant funds would rely on to support that project. This next column is a total amount requested, and then the 2021 award allocation is here as well for what we had awarded projects last year. Funding recommendation, staff funding recommendations are in orange, and then this is the difference between the award allocations and what staff is recommending in this column here. So let me see. So currently, as this spreadsheet is sorted, it's sorted by the highest scoring proposal to the lowest scoring proposal. But in order to do the tapering, I resorted it again by years funded, and you can maybe see a little bit more organized with how we went about it. So starting off with the new seed projects, they're all of the new projects scored 70 or more. So the staff recommendation is to fully fund the projects where we fully fund those projects, and then projects that requested beyond 120,000, we would sort of keep within that range, not so to speak like a cap, but just, that's our maximum funding range that the committee is agreeable to. That would be the most we would be awarding, like BETZEDEC, for example, and CRLA. So that's the initial for new projects. And then moving down, these are all first year projects seeking second year funding. We looked at the scorings here, So our thought was if they scored 70 or higher, they would get very much close to what we awarded them last year. Because we did the haircut, I think the staff reasoning was we'll just kind of round up to that nearest 1,000, which puts everyone about 2% more than what they were granted. Fairly new project, very high funding priority scores at 5s and 4s. And there was one project, let me take a look. Inland County Legal Services, although they're a second-year project, they did score a 66. So we wanted the rubric to be responsive in terms of grant funding amount. So our recommendation, therefore, would be to cut 5% from what we had awarded them in 2021.
That was a second-year project?
This was a second-year project for Inland County Legal Services. And you can also see here, funding priority was listed as a 3. So we kind of made a subset for each of the years funded, whether or not they were above 70 or below 70, and then made increments. So second-year project seeking third-year funding, 5% cut. If you were below that 60 point or 70 point threshold, it'd be a 10% cut. And that's how we kind of went about it for each group according to their prior years funded.
Right. So the cuts were from last year's funding amount.
Yeah, last year's funding amount as opposed to the requested amount, because we find that a lot of projects, they request the same amounts year after year, and generally the committee has utilized what they had funded them the prior year as kind of the baseline or starting point. Go ahead, Eric. Did you have a question?
Okay, so I think I understand your thinking on the tapering. Well, what did you do like with the project that give me like an 8-year project or something? A plus.
So our oldest projects in this pool is legal assistance for seniors. I think they're seeking 11th year funding. So our and they scored a 62, and so because they're below 70 points, our recommendation was a 25% cut, just kind of going down those 5% increments. And then public counsel, they scored a 69, so similarly it'd be a 25% cut. In addition, as you can see, public counsel, 15% would be for the partnership grant fund, so they're also well funded. I did just want to flag as well for the committee's consideration. Let me see this one. Legal Services in Northern California. They are older than 5-year project, and they scored a 79, which is they're over that 70 point threshold. But instead of kind of going in line of the proposed reductions, staff recommendation would be to potentially just fund them the same amount they were given last year, considering the county served. So that was we had that as an exception, and then we did want to also flag, these 2 lowest scoring projects, which were Central California Legal Services and Riverside Legal Aid, who both scored under 60, and so they're both older than 5 years, and then so the staff recommendation was potentially the largest cut, which is 30%. And if funding, we had worked with a smaller funding number when staff did this exercise, so it was potentially not fund them would be another recommendation as well, just given the low scoring, fairly low funding priority. If worst case came to worse, that would have been the staff recommendation. But as you can see here with these numbers and the proposals, we're actually at an $84,000. We still have $84,000 to distribute. So I'll pause here. I know that was a lot of math and a lot of calculating. I just want to make sure it made sense to the committee. This is the first time we're probably implementing a more systematic approach, but we just wanted to draw relations with how the rubric scores played into how to incorporate the rubric scores, years funded, into kind of what the overall distribution could look like. So these are proposed numbers. Any thoughts or?
Sorry. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
comments.
Oh, no, I was just asking if there were any comments. And so Eric, you're welcome to share your.
Yeah, so just the total
that you provisionally recommend. I know we're not bound by this at all, but are you saying that you underspent or you overspent?
We underspent. So
okay.
If the committee is happy with this as a starting point, I think staff's next recommendations would be maybe sorting by subject area, substantive area, or counties served. If you want to put more money in certain projects, you know, given if they're rural, if they're going to cover a substantive area that might have increased need in 2022. We just wanted to make sure like that overall, that underlying structure of the tapered approach, if the committee was in agreement of it or had any thoughts as to what that could look like. I also did want to call out, I know during the review team sessions, one question that I had informally asked each of the review teams was, you know, what would we like to do in the instance if there's a standoff scoring? And so the majority had indicated, you know, taking the average of 3 scores, it'd be the 2 committee members and staffs. And so those are just reflected in these scores that have 1 decimal point. But in the overall spread, I'm not sure if that would, if it substantively impacted their score. I think one call out would just be Family Violence Law Center. They're fairly close to the 70 points. So I don't know if that would be another point of consideration for the committee. All right. So I'm thinking maybe if we can start by the new projects and maybe go down chunk by chunk. Does that work, Christina? Or
yeah, I was gonna say maybe sort by funding priority and look at that first.
Yeah, I'll do largest to smallest.
Because that's where the rural category and the number of years comes into play, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So funding priority. You know, I think just not surprisingly, the very newer projects, they're all at the 4s or the 5s.
Crystal, can I just ask if you might freeze the column headers there so we can keep those in mind?
Yeah, I have these frozen right now, but let me
I was just hoping to be able to see them when scrolling down there.
I don't know if Excel lets you freeze panes when you are using this sorting option.
Oh, all right.
You know, I've struggled with this.
She already sorted it, so now she can freeze it. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. I have a little menu bar for my sharing my screen. Let me just move that out of the way too. Would it be would it be better to start with like those with the top funding priorities or the bottoms, just to kind of see how
I think the top.
Okay. Yeah, so SELS, that's a new project. So our recommendation is to fully fund them for their ask amount. Bethzetic is also at a 20 or at 5 points, capping them up or having the range be at 120, and that would be the maximum. Bethzetic again, they're 120, so that would be fully funding that project. CRLA is at 137, so instilling that 120 maximum.
Well, can you, we can't, oh wait, maybe it's just me. Can anybody see the recommendation? There.
There we go.
Okay. Okay.
120, and then Compton Self-Help, also new project of funding priority of 5. We're also recommending to fully fund that. So those 5 projects, I think more or less will be funded or kind of kept to the top of the funding range.
So there's one here, 55,000 recommendation, $74,000 ask. I have to go across to see what this is. Imperial County unlawful detainer.
And I think also they're They're older than the 5-year project, but they are in Imperial County, which is a rural county. So I guess this would be kind of a pause point to see if the committee would like to maybe increase their award amount with that consideration.
I think we should, because it's a decrease by 20% is what it says in the next column, right, from the year before.
Yeah, just mostly because of years funded. But again, we can make that decrease smaller. Could I just maybe get some numbers on the board for maybe the new projects? Is the committee in agreement with the staff recommendations of kind of carrying these amounts forward, fully funding, and then keeping at that 120 cap or 120 top of the range? Would that be okay?
Which ones? The top spreadsheet
Yeah,
is gnarly.
Just these projects. The new projects,
Okay.
does the committee agree with those maybe initial staff recommendations and just carrying those over so we can move on to see where we can add some monies to?
What was the remote?
ProSay Technology Initiative. Who is that organization?
Bethzetic.
Okay.
So just to be clear, this is sorted by the rubric score and then funding priority. Is that right?
Currently, it's just funding priority. We're doing it like one line at a time. It's not a multi-sort. Yeah.
So, well, it matches fairly much the same, I guess, but not exact.
I mean, these numbers seem like a good starting point to me.
Yeah, those sort of seems like a no-brainer to me. And then the only one that's not fully funded is the one that asked for more than 120, right?
Correct. It'd be the Bethzetic and
yeah.
We're pretty confident they probably can find
yes.
Alternate funding.
Yes.
Okay. And then I think we're talking about elder law and advocacy. Is that the one we wanted to talk about next, or maybe San Luis Obispo? For the most part, San Luis Obispo and Legal Aid of Marin, I think the staff recommendation is just to fund them very similar to what they were given last year at 100,000 and 80,000. Does anyone in the committee want to maybe increase that, or we'll just keep that as very similar to what they got last year?
Well, this one, San Luis Obispo County, scored very high.
Yes.
And they asked for 115, and that's rural. So I wouldn't be opposed to giving them more. But...
we have 80 something thousand, so we could be the committee could be judicious in terms of where to increase. Would that be like an increase to like 105?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Great. So they'll receive 7% more than what they got in 2021. The next project is Legal Aid of Marin. Their ask was 80. I think it's very similar, which is their original ask. I'm going to carry over that 80,000. Great. All right, so back to the YOLO Consumer Clinic. Their ask is 67. They were granted 62 last year. Staff recommendation was to, match that amount, or we can meet their ask amount at 67, taking into account that's the only program in YOLO County. Is the committee okay with that? So Elder Law and Advocacy is Imperial County and Lawful Detainer Clinic. That's Imperial County. Their request is 74, and then staff recommendation was 55, just taking into consideration the tapering. But does the committee feel strongly to increase this amount, considering that I think 98% relies on the budget, and they're fairly high in terms of funding priority, just because Imperial County is also rural.
Are they the only program in Imperial County?
Yes.
They actually work together with CRLA. They share an office, and I believe, if not this year, at least in years past, they've kind of worked with CRLA staff to deliver these services. But between the two of them, they are the only game in town, and they leverage each other.
70,000 would be very close to what they got in 2021. But I don't know if that's, do we want to put that number in for now and then maybe revisit, or?
I think that's a good starting.
Yeah, sorry, I've been talking and been muted the whole
Oh,
time.
hi, this is Mary.
It's not your fault.
We're not ignoring you.
Yeah, let's start with 71. Thank you.
71?
Yeah.
All right. These are the 3 NLS projects: Pasadena Continuum, Stabilizing Families, and Chatsworth. Staff recommendation, because they're seeking second-year partnership grant funding, was to match their amounts. Does the committee feel strongly to increase these amounts or carry them forward as part of the committee's tentative funding?
So on the Chatsworth Technology, I think that was our working group, and they were at a 70. So Dan, are you there? Remind me, didn't we have some issues with that one?
But we had issues with all 3 of them.
We were concerned about whether they really had innovative technology.
I think that's accurate. They did respond to our questions and report that they are working on innovative technology. But what's really happening here is that NLS has large hubs providing a range of self-help services in these different locations, and the different locations have a focus. So Chatsworth has a consumer law focus, and they're going to try to bring in technology, but it hasn't actually happened yet. Pasadena has a focus on UD, but they do plenty of family law too, and it's not as tightly focused as maybe the proposals indicate. That being said, these are sort of institutional, high volume, high quality projects that have been part of the court's, service structure for 25 years. They are definitely the organization that works most closely with the LA Unified, with the LA Superior Court to make sure self-help services are delivered across the board, and in particularly at these locations. So yeah, the technology piece is maybe aspirational, but they do their best to provide technology, to provide consumer law assistance there. And this project and also Pasadena are, there's nothing wrong with these. We've actually funded them in the past. They're back for 2nd round now.
NLS is good at that. Repackaging.
The guardianship project is, I think, truly a new effort. It is trying to bring services up into that Antelope Valley region, which is, I lived in the valley. I didn't realize that Van Nuys to Antelope Valley is 60 miles, and to Mosque it's 16. That's a lot of territory. So I'm really glad to see that stabilizing families piece has been added.
Yeah,
the other 2, yeah, it's not like this is anything really new, but it's not like there's anything wrong with it either.
I mean, I would go to staff's recommendations.
Fine to me.
Great, so I'll carry those over for now.
Hey, Crystal, can I just make
for putting a pin on comments? You said that we're going to devote the next meeting to lessons learned. I just want to make a comment that I've made before, and I'm a broken record on this, but the chart in the application that lists services rendered and the number of people served. I just wish we could work on that, because I find that really hard to read.
Yeah,
it doesn't really communicate anything to me. I can't tell from reading that chart what they're doing exactly, how many people they're serving. The numbers seem duplicative and overlapping, and it's just very confusing.
Yeah, and we're definitely noting that too. And I think it's work with Judicial Council. It's part of the evaluation just to see how we'll reword it to make it clear, I think, for the committee and applicants as well. But thank you. I'll note that. Okay, great. So we're now at funding priority 4s, which are fairly high as well. So I think they're in line with a lot of the second year projects. So I'm going to just take a peek here. San Diego Volunteer Lawyers Program, their Central Division restraining orders. We had 5% cuts as a recommended for the staff recommendation for these projects, you know, that scored over 70 points.
So can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
About the LAFLA project? I noticed that they include expungements. Did staff follow up with them that should be excluded?
Yeah, I'm following up with them. And I will provide the working group an update, but I think they'll be fine because they do cover some other substantive areas. But it'll be part of the follow-up after the meeting.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is the committee okay with the staff recommendations for, you know, a -5%? They're seeking third-year funding, and, you know, fairly strong projects all over 70 points, at least through these chunks, these projects here. Central Division, Restraining Order, Torrance Self-Help Center, the Tulare County, and then the De facto and Adoptive Parent Assistance Project.
These are all with the funding priority of 4.
So 16?
Yes.
Yeah.
What about the one that asked for 71,000 and the recommendation is 35.5? Shriver Sash Self-Help?
That is JDC, Justice and Diversity Center. So they're actually a third-year program seeking fourth-year funding. And so the staff recommendation was actually based on what they were awarded last year, which was 39,000. I think primarily it's also because, you know, 14% of the fund, like they're very well-funded program.
Okay.
So just revisiting those second-year projects seeking third-year funding with a strong priority. Does the committee in agreement that a 5% cut, we can, should I carry over staff's recommendations for now? Or are there any projects we want to maybe increase funding to looking at it?
The Tulare County Unlawful Detainer Workshop, this is because it's a third-year program. That's why we wanted to drop to, is that 65?
Yes.
Yeah.
65. They were granted 68 last year, so it would be a 5% decrease for that. But again, I think that might be one of the few projects in Tulare. So the committee wishes to increase that amount. That's fine.
I might suggest we at least give them what we gave last year or around that.
That 70,000 sound okay? Okay.
Trying to read them.
Yeah.
And then am I okay to carry over this Central Division Restraining Order Clinic, the staff recommendation amount over of 84,000? And then this is San Diego, and that would be the 93,000. So Public Law Center has a de facto and adoptive parent assistance project. They scored pretty high, pretty well at 75. And then again, that would be in line with that 5% decrease for projects seeking third-year funding. Mike to carry over staff's recommendation of that 46,500 allocation. The next, there's a couple of projects. So these all had high funding priorities at 4 points. There's a couple of third year and fourth year projects. You know, our decreases were again recommended due to years funded, but do you want to take that in consideration that they did have higher funding priorities and fund them a bit higher than the staff recommendation? I'll start with WACBA's Domestic Violence Legal Services Project. You know, their ask is 99 and the staff recommendation was 80,000, which would only be a 10% decrease from what they were awarded last year. Does the committee feel strongly in terms of, you know, keeping this recommendation or potentially increasing it given their higher funding priority?
Can I clarify something?
Mm-hmm.
The funding priority is that's what grew out of each group, or is that what staff recommended?
No, these are pulled each from the calibration session. So if it was the review team's calibrated funding priority, so the 1 through 5, and then this was just multiplied by 4.
The recommendation on that one seems okay to me.
It's okay to me
Too.
Okay, great. 80,000. And then this one was the JDC Cyber Stash. Very similar to what we got. It is a larger decrease, but again, I think we pointed out, you know, 14% funds of partnership grant would fund this project. So is the committee okay with the 35,500 proposal? Okay. All right, next is Orange County Consumer Debt. This is a project seeking 5th year funding. Let me just highlight it here. 5th year funding. Their ask is actually not, it's 29,000, but we just wanted to try to be consistent. They did score 70. So our recommendation was to maybe do a 15% cut. But I don't know if the committee may want to increase that amount just because their ask amount also is a little bit much smaller than some other projects.
I'd be comfortable with a higher amount on that.
Yeah, so their ask is 29,000. We gave them about 23,000 last year. Would it be, does committee want to have
start there?
23?
Yeah.
Great.
I'm sorry, that amount was 23?
23,000, yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next is Central California Legal Services Tenant Landlord Housing Project. They are seeking 7th year funding. They're in Fresno, but again, the staff recommendation was to potentially decrease their funding by 25% in comparison to their prior year. I don't know if the committee feels strongly, given some rural considerations and a fairly high funding priority, to increase that amount.
I mean, we could. I remember this one. And my concern was that it didn't seem like they did anything last year, and that it seems to be run by a paralegal without supervision. And I was concerned about that. I know they responded back saying that an attorney does review everything. So yeah, they have a very tiny amount in their budget for the attorney. But I think, Dan, don't you know about this one? How they're doing it?
Well, you know, my information isn't current, but it probably hasn't changed much since I learned about it. There is a person on their staff who is a paralegal, who is their, I think, team leader for family law or something along those lines. An extremely highly skilled, highly trained professional who happens not to be an attorney, but kind of does the trainings for the attorneys at the program. she does have a little piece of attorney supervision, but that's essentially to placate us. And I don't know how much work the project actually does. It's just sort of part of their budget that we help them do some of their self-help services. I do know that it's a perennial challenge to get traction in these counties. They've put a lot of energy into trying to get different things to work, get people to show up at stuff. It's always been uphill sledding for them.
Well, Dan, this is a 6-year project.
Mm-hmm.
They must have evaluations. What do they look like?
Yeah, so can I just interject? Just in terms of evaluations, what we'll talk about in the June meeting too is I'm going to give an overview of the evaluations across the board, but generally all projects under deliver, were not able to meet their service goals primarily due to the courthouse closures. So I think it's kind of a hard, it'd be difficult to maybe utilize evaluation as a strong determining factor, like especially for this grant year. So go ahead, Dan, but I just wanted to
but I'm not talking about that.
Yeah.
Historically.
But I get that. Now, 2020 was an aberrant year, but we have 6 years of history with this project. Do they have evaluations going back, before that?
It's not terribly robust.
I would have to say, I'd have to interject, Dan. Sorry, Dan, but I think overall evaluations aren't terribly robust. So I think it's a little unfair to say that for this particular project, because we looked at everybody's evaluations. Overall, the evaluations aren't very strong.
Yeah, I completely.
I think Melanie might want to say something, but.
Hang on.
Melanie, you might need to mute either your computer or your phone.
I guess while Melanie's working.
She's having trouble with her Zoom connection, so I think she'll comment when she can figure that out.
I'm just curious if.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Go ahead, Melanie.
No. Yes. No.
Yes.
Yes.
Did I leave? Oh, you can hear me. Okay, great. What I was going to say is that we noticed the issue with evaluations on several of the reports that we read as well. And what we were going to talk to you about maybe separately is perhaps putting together a presentation for all of the panelists that, for all the participants at some point about evaluations and about how to do them and such, because a lot of them are lacking, and I don't think it's their fault. I just think evaluations is sort of a newfangled thing that people are really looking more at, and data collection. There's whole new methods, and I just don't know that people are that versed in how to properly evaluate. So we were going to, again, talk to you about putting together something so that we can help the programs to do a more robust evaluation in the future.
That's a great idea.
Incredibly valuable.
We actually did something like that in 2005. So it's probably due.
So going back to just their, given that and, understanding of kind of our evaluation data that, we're going to work on and try to improve in terms of what we get back from applicants and making that a little bit more clear. In terms of their funding for 2022, as proposed, staff is recommending a 25% decrease primarily because it is an older project, but also with the understanding it is in Fresno and there's not a lot of projects currently funded by this grant there. does the committee want to keep the staff recommendation or potentially increase their award?
Yeah, they had a 4s across the board, correct, as far as funding priority?
They're at a 4, yes.
So yeah, I'm not sure where we are at on our total amounts, but I'd be disinclined to cut them 25%. Maybe some cut is in order or closer to their
2020.
Christina, did you review this project?
Yeah, you know what? I think I got this one confused with the other one from CCLS.
They have 3. So
which is the one with the paralegal? I don't think that's this one.
it might be the.
It's the guardianship. Yep. Okay, so everything I said, put it in a box, and when we get to the guardianship one. Sorry.
I'm gonna just put a number here to see, like maybe 60,000, and see what kind of decrease that would be. So that's a 13% cut or 13% decrease from what they were awarded in 2021. Is the committee comfortable with that? Maybe we can revisit if we're still under budget.
Yeah,
what was the number there?
60,000.
Thank you.
Yeah, this one was better than the other one. I had 2.
Yeah, and there, yeah, you can see that.
I remember now.
I think we're like towards the halfway point. We're at 11646 so far. I think we're doing well. So let's carry on to, oh, sorry. Carry on to the next one. Consumer Rights Clinic, Inland County Legal Services, their funding priority, we're at the 3s now. So they're actually seeking second-year funding, but I think their total score was a bit lower. I think according to the staff recommendations, we thought this would warrant maybe a 5% decrease from what they were awarded last year. So that would bring them at 88,000, and they were awarded 92 in 2021. That's here. This was review team 3. I don't know if Chris, Judge Jaskol, Chris McConkey, if you have any thoughts on this specific particular project or thoughts on the staff recommendation.
I don't want to talk before Judge Jaskol or Christian if they. I can tell you what I remember from our conversation. This one was the one that it was a project that uses proposed software that a different grant will be paying for, that the client will sit down and fill out the software for their consumer matter, and the software will help them generate court forms and settlement letters. And then an ICLS attorney would look over the software generated legal document with them. So the ICLS attorney kind of comes in a little bit later in the process, but they're still overseeing it. Our team took note that it meets only, I think it meets only 1 day per week. It was kind of modest in its targets. It was sort of in line with the other applications our team reviewed as far as how many clients and workshops it was going to do, but it was the low end. And we sort of thought that the software piece might be a way to try and reach more people, but we noted that it was a little less hands-on. That was what I remember from ICLS's.
Is this like debt collection kind of stuff? Debt collection cases? Is that what we're dealing with?
Yeah,
here?
low-income consumer debtors.
It seems like a bunch of like the project we looked at in the Valley in Chatsworth was like doing the same thing. I just wonder how many people are.
So I did ask the Chatsworth project about this, and they said that they were in communication with the people at UC Irvine who are doing the ICLS project and tracking their progress to see if it'll work in Los Angeles, and we'll adopt it if it does, and we'll come up with something new if it doesn't, which makes me think that they aren't very far along on their tech track right now, but that nobody's reinventing too many wheels because they're still watching the first one being built.
Well, it's not clear that, yeah, it's not clear. I think out of our group, it wasn't clear from the application that they were actually utilizing the software.
I don't think it exists yet.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, just by way of disclosure, as Crystal knows, but basically, Judge Jasko and I just gave everybody 3s for funding priorities. So, because, you know, we don't, I mean, with maybe with 1 or 2 exceptions, I guess, but we just sort of went down the middle because we didn't know that it was a way to, like, we didn't really feel, at least I'll speak for myself. It's hard to know what the funding priority is when you haven't had a chance to sort of meet to find out what everybody else's projects involve. So, I mean, seeing how many are 8 is just interesting. But yeah, I mean, in terms of this project sort of graded up because of where they're doing it, because it's in a less served area of the state.
So should we go with the staff recommendation, Chris, or are you thinking a little bit more?
Well, I think I'd just go with the staff recommendation here. I guess my inclination was to say, like, well, it might even be less, but seems like, you know, people are going to, the programs are going to largely get what they need. We're closing the gap pretty quickly, so I'd go with staff recommendation on that.
Were they able to implement the program at all? Did we get any evaluations back for last year?
I think this is going to be, for ICLS, this is going to be their 2nd year of funding. So their first year was during the pandemic.
Yeah, their evaluation information won't be available to the end of this year.
They're doing it now for the first year.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. So I carried over that 88,000 amount. Also, I think these next chunk of projects are seeking 3rd year funding with a funding priority of 3. And I think 2 of these projects, sorry, I'm trying to, Legal Access Alameda and then Legal Aid Foundation of Santa Barbara County, they both scored 70, funding priority 3. The staff recommendation was similarly a 5%. A 5% cut from what they were awarded last year. Does that seem okay? Okay.
The Santa Barbara one, I assume they're just serving that many more people. That seems on the high end for compared to other conservatorship and domestic violence.
Yeah, they're basically I think, if not the only QLSP in that county, and they're in 3 courthouses as part of and really in close partnership with the court there. So only, like, I think this funds 1 attorney and a paralegal or another position, but they do have that's it's them who provides self-help services in the county. So
they do a lot of practice areas and a lot of people in all 3 courthouses.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
All right, so the next is partnership to assist limited conservatorship litigants. This is legal assistance for seniors. You know, I think they're seeking 3rd year funding, and staff is recommending a 10% cut, primarily because they did score under 70 points, but definitely up to the committee if you want to maybe increase their award amount, or if this is okay to carry over.
Where in Alameda County are they?
This is a clinic that works with 3 different courthouses. The actual hearings are in Berkeley, but they provide services at self-help counters in Hayward and Oakland as well.
Okay. then I think I would consider raising it a little bit.
Any amount in mind, 60,000?
Yeah,
Okay,
I think so.
great. So next is LASSD's name change and gender marker change self-help clinic. They were funding priority 3. They're seeking 4th year funding. They scored a 70, and I guess because they're requesting 4th year funding using that tapered approach, staff recommendation was a 10% decrease from what they were awarded last year. But again, I think we do have some leeway. So if the committee wants to award any additional monies, I think we have some flexibility in these last row of projects.
Did they change the name of the project?
Gender marker wasn't what it originally
Right.
said, but
That's
it's
what
not,
I was just Googling. Yeah.
yeah, it's a different name, but it's not a different project.
I mean, did they change that from when our subcommittee reviewed the application?
Was it? Oh.
Well, because like the discussion, not debate, that we had in our meeting was that, you know, that if anything, this is a project that could have scored more highly on innovation, because they could be sort of meeting the moment on so many of the trans rights issues that are sort of emerging, and that they really didn't do that in their application material, both in terms of how they described what they were doing, but also in terms of the project itself. Was just very traditional sort of name change stuff, without any real discussion about outreach or implication, et cetera, et cetera. So it's sort of interesting, I guess. I don't know if something changed while we were.
I have in my notes on our review team scoring spreadsheet the same name that we have on here. But I don't. It's not a dispute that you saw it written differently somewhere else. Just that.
I know last year it had a different name, but.
Okay.
I can pull up their application to see what they submitted.
I'm looking at my stack currently, but does that impact, or want the committee to potentially maybe increase the staff from the staff recommendation that we're I think.
Who are they? Who's the organization that's
LASSD, Legal Aid Society of San Diego.
And they have two. They have two projects. Yeah, Christian did a great job of summarizing what the review team 3's like overall impression of it was, which was that it's really important work, but they're not reaching very far. So I don't think that, I just pulled up their application. They don't do any workshops, and they aspire to reach 400. I think it was 450 clients in a year, which is on the low end of what I think a lot of other projects also submitted. And yeah, they didn't have. It was like a little short on details, especially with continuity planning. I think they just said like, we'll look for other funding, but they didn't actually describe what they would do. So I think this project met everyone's expectations, but it didn't exceed in any of its categories.
Yeah, I don't know why we should increase above the staff's recommendation.
Okay, I'll carry it over for now. I think these figures in red may impact our end total. All right, so we'll maybe revisit. So the next one is the Domestic Violence Project from Family Violence Law Center. They're seeking 4th year funding. Their funding priority was at 3, and they were below 70 points. Make sure I'm reading across the line correctly. And because of that, staff recommendation was potentially a 15% decrease from what they were awarded in prior years. So that would bring them around 21,000. Their ask is 25,000.
They're obviously getting a lot of other funding, right?
Yes. Yeah, if it's 4% of their total budget, yes. Is the committee comfortable? I can bump it up to 21. 1,000, just so it's not an odd number.
Yeah.
Okay, I was just trying to be equitable in the percentages when we presented. Okay, that's a 14% decrease. Okay, great. So next is the UD clinic expansion project from, again, Legal Aid Society of San Diego. They're seeking 5th year funding. We have 3. They did score better than the name change at 76. Primarily because they're seeking 5th year funding, staff recommendation was potentially a 15% decrease from their 2021 award. Would the committee like to increase the staff recommendation? Given that it potentially, I think it is a stronger project than their last one. They did score higher, so they'll be covering housing issues in San Diego. So.
The one thing that our review team really appreciated about this project was LASSD, Legal Aid Society of San Diego, went out of its way to describe the services they were going to be providing to low-income landlords and not just tenants.
Yes. So their request amount is 80,000. Staff recommendation is 67. Does the committee feel strongly to potentially increase that by a little bit, or?
Some increase seems appropriate.
I'll throw out a number, 70,000. Is there another like amount? Okay. Great. So next is another unlawful detainer workshop seeking 5th year funding by Community Legal Aid SoCal. This project, because it was below that 70 point kind of threshold we were utilizing, we were recommending a 20% decrease from what they were funded last year. So the ask amount is 66,000. Staff recommendation is 55,000.
So I'm just curious as to whether we now have 2 UD projects right in a row here, and one is rated what, 76, and one is rated 67. Why? I mean, why do we think so much more highly of the one in San Diego than the one in Norwalk?
So I have the breakdown of the scores. If you'd like to see, Eric, it's a very big spreadsheet, so I was just trying to keep it manageable. But I think this will.
Someone knows who was involved in reviewing the projects.
I know review team 1 did it. I don't actually have my notes in front of me for that particular project for CLA SoCal. I recall there being weak continuity planning because it is a continuing project. Sorry.
Actually, Crystal, can you go ahead and unhide so that we can see the breakdown of the other scores?
The court involvement was meets, project impact was meets, admin was above, so continuity planning, it was out of 3. So I think the San Diego project maybe edged out in terms of court involvement and project impact because those were both exceed expectations. Is that helpful to know, Eric?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
As a reviewer for the San Diego one, but not the Norwalk one, we gave it an exceeds because they aspire to provide services in 4,000 like instances, 4,000 instances of individual services is what they have in their application, and we thought that was impactful.
Great. So
staff recommendation on this one.
Yeah.
That's 55.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great is the Orange County Courthouse Guardianship Clinic from Public Law Center. So they're seeking 5th year funding, again below that 70 points, funding priority of 3. So staff is recommending a 20% cut from what they were funded in 2021. Just to note, I know their total request amount is 60,000, but we did only award them about 40,000 last year. So that's the number we're working off of for this project. And I want to say this was similarly continuity planning scoring might have impacted this specific project. Is the committee comfortable with carrying moving forward the staff recommendation, or would like to increase that amount?
I think it's okay.
All right, next is Santa Clara University Alexander Law Center's Consumer Debt Clinic. They are seeking 5th year funding. Their score was a 66, so again below that 70 points. So the staff recommendation was similarly a 20% cut from what they were awarded in 2021. So pausing here to see if the committee feels whether or not we should increase the staff recommendation for this project.
So we're the only funder for this program, correct?
For Santa Clara, yes. And I think Santa Clara might be the only county project in that county.
Wow, really? There's no other Santa Clara County project?
I'm gonna sort this so I can confirm.
Doesn't surprise me.
Yes, that's the only one.
Why?
For partnership.
That's a surprise. I'm surprised.
They're just underrepresented. It's really interesting. But you get some in San Mateo, and then it just trickles out. The Central Coast starts at San Mateo County.
Yeah, but right, but Santa Clara is not that rich. I mean, it's got some rich folks in it, as many counties do, but maybe they're have a higher percentage. But still, I wouldn't think it would be so devoid. I mean, okay, this was one that we had reviewed. Can you scroll over one more time, just so I can see what the staff recommendation is?
Oh, staff recommendation is right here, 47 out of the 60. Because it was a 20%.
Yeah.
Oh, there. Sorry, I see it now. Move you.
This was, I believe this is a law school based
clinic. Is Santa Clara University.
And my recollection from our team's discussion, what we took particular note of was that this clinic meets only 1 day per week. It only meets in court on Wednesdays. It aspires to serve about 250 clients, which we thought was sort of on the low end. So it's like less than 1 client per business day. And it'll also do 2 workshops. And we took note that given the scale of the work, it was seeking $60,000, which we thought looked too high compared to what other programs were asking for and what they planned to do. The other note I had, I think we gave it a meets expectations on everything, if I remember correctly. I'll pull it up. But the other note I had was that we noted the attorney supervision was only 0.2 FTE, and that for like a law school clinic, we thought maybe for a $60,000 budget, the attorney supervision needed to be higher.
Maybe we can go back to them and ask them to explain why they need $60,000 with so little attorney supervision.
And I'll pull up their application right now. In case the committee wants to like circle back later in the meeting, I'll see what they put in their budget.
I guess my only concern would be that would a 20% cut jeopardize the program if it were the only funder?
And we could also increase it slightly, maybe like 50,000. I think one thing for follow up is we're going to be sharing the tentative funding recommendations and getting feedback from the organizations in terms of how that would impact the proposed project. So is 50,000 okay maybe to put as a placeholder for now, or does the committee want to?
Yeah, it's maybe, but Chris, are you pulling up the application? I'm curious as to what they're spending their money on.
I do.
am
I
too.
have it in front of me. I can, Crystal, if you want me to share my screen, I can share
No,
everyone.
it's okay. Just tell us.
So the it is actually going almost entirely to personnel. So $51,634 is personnel. It is $23,000, which is the 0.2 FTE attorney. They have $11,500. I'm rounding, goes to a paralegal, and $2,683 to other staff. Their employee benefits are about $14,000. So this reminds me, we took note that because it was law school staff, the compensation was trended a bit higher than it does for legal aid nonprofit staff. I think the university gives, it's a more expensive like benefits and payroll tax ratio. And we actually calculated what the person's annual salary would be at 0.2 FTE and took note that it was particularly high salary compared to what like a legal aid attorney would make, but probably because it's a law school staff member.
This is something I'm actually like putting together a memo about for the law school consideration of the rules committee about law schools. But it is just a reality right now for us that law schools tend to run more expensive than other projects.
So it's mostly personnel and a little bit of admin.
Adjuncts very much.
What was that, Sarah?
I didn't hear the last statement.
They're not paying their adjuncts very much, I'll
Tell you that.
They're adjuncts.
Oh, I see. Well, I'm fine going up to 50.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I think we're in our last few. So next is the Caregivers and Small Estates Accessing Justice Legal Aid of San Bernardino. They're seeking 5th year funding. They did score below the 70 points, which is why staff is recommending a 20% decrease. We also did want to call out at San Bernardino as well. I believe this may be the only apprenticeship grant project in that county as well. So I don't know if the staff committee would like to increase the staff recommended amount. They are requesting a pretty high amount at 138. But they were awarded 98,000 last year, so kind of using that as a reference.
I would support an increase in this one. I think it's considered to be a pretty valuable project. So I think the increase was they're adding in a probate piece, and it wasn't clear how much they really needed for that. So I'm not sure we need to increase that seriously, but I'd give them a little bit more.
Great. Any numbers come to mind? 80,000. That would be an 18% decrease from what they were awarded in the prior year. So we have about 234,000 left, and 5 more projects. So maybe Family Law Day of Court is a project from Legal Access Alameda. They're seeking 6-year funding, so this is a 5+ year project. They did score fairly well for at 75 points, but just taking into account the years funded, staff recommendation was a 20% decrease from their prior year. They're requesting 30,000, so just wanted to check in to see if you wanted to maybe increase that or keep the staff recommendation, maybe round up to 24 or
About 25.
Yeah, 25.
25. Okay. That takes them to 15%. All right. Okay. Next is the guardianship project from Central California Legal Services. I think these are Christina's comments earlier regarding this project, and this is reflected in their low rubric score of 55. So we weren't sure of the amount when staff made these recommendations as to I think we had a lower amount. So we were either proposing potentially not funding this project, like if the funding, if the funding was limited, or a fairly significant decrease, which would be 30% from what they were awarded last year. So their ask amount is $65,000, just for reference. Does the committee want to go with the staff recommendation, or potentially maybe increase a little bit? I think there's a little bit of wiggle room given the balance, and it is Fresno, or like they did score one of the lowest for the rubric, and I don't know if that should also be reflected in the allocated amounts.
Can we come back to that one?
Sure. These are the tough ones. That's why they're in red. The next is the Small Estates Partnership, and this was Riverside Legal Aid. So this was actually the lowest score of the whole applicant pool. They're 54 points. They're seeking 7th year funding. So similar to CCLS, the staff recommendation was potentially a 30% cut from what they were awarded in the prior year. Or potentially not funding as well. So as you can see, their ask amount was 110. We gave them 98,000 last year, so it would be a fairly significant decrease at about 70,000.
Does anybody remember why they scored so low?
Yeah, this was our group, and we. So wait a minute, Riverside. Yeah. So wait, so this is Small Estates.
Yes.
So you say the substantive areas are conservatorship and guardianship. I actually thought it was just probate.
It might have.
I'm not sure why we characterized it that way, and that was the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure that that's correct on that spreadsheet.
Okay.
Anyway, so to answer the question, the focus was limited. Again, I've heard the comment about the evaluations. They're probably weak across the board, I guess, but this one, it was hard to see that they were serving a lot of people, even if you go back to a pre-pandemic year. But maybe it was just a poorly written application. Maybe where they just don't have a great sort of grant writing staff. I don't know, but it just wasn't very impressive. But we did have some concerns that they're in Riverside, and this is some indication that they were providing some level of valuable service. So I don't know, we weren't wild about it, but we were okay with funding it to some extent.
Can we get clarification on whether it's just probate or they are providing additional services?
Well, I think it is just probate. I mean, we can go back quickly to the application.
Yeah. I just looked at the profile sheet. It is just probate, but they do serve 3 courthouses.
Sorry,
Riverside,
might have been
whatever, and it is Riverside.
The service numbers this year are already 3 times what they reported for all of last year, if that helps. Last year, they reported around 27 people served, which is really, I mean, even given the circumstances, you'd look for better than that. But apparently this year, they're already up to more than 70 through April. So that is a positive sign. The court has implemented technology to make it easier for these services to be provided. And I think it might be facilitating more people using it a little bit. The county self-help center has started providing some forms assistance, and they're going to be helping to funnel people to this service. So the way it's going to be working is the attorney is present during the probate calendar and the self-represented probate calendar. And when someone shows up with notes and isn't able to follow through with whatever's happening that day, they'll just say, go to the breakout room. You've got a legal aid attorney to help you out today, and come back when you've got it straightened out.
What did they project as the annual number of people they'd be serving?
I believe the number was 250 that they want to reach.
So they're on pace to be well ahead of that.
I think that they're on track for it.
Well, you said they're They're at 70 now.
Yeah.
Yeah, through April.
So that'd
For a
be
third of the year.
third of the year. Okay.
Mhm.
All right.
Is that right? Wait a minute. Wait. Yeah. Third of the year.
Through April, not up to April. Okay.
Mhm. And I'm going to, you know, sort of underscore what Eric said. This, I think, is a project that was not helped much by the way the application was written.
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
And I see that their funding priority was at 2 as well, as another data point. So, I mean, I think a decrease is probably what the committee may want, but I don't know if it's 30% or slightly smaller than that.
Maybe we give them 70, just to round it off. But give them a substantial. And send them the message that we really weren't impressed with the application. They need to do a better job next year.
I have a friendly relationship with their executive director, and I think that's a conversation I could have with her, because this is not the first grants program where this issue has, I think, redounded to their detriment.
Okay, great. So the last two, similarly situated, is legal assistance for seniors and public counsel. They're those, I guess, both guardianship projects, seeking 11th year and 13th year funding. Noted the review teams noted funding priorities at 2, and both scores were below the 70 threshold. So keeping in mind the staff recommendations, I think we were recommending a 25% decrease from what they were awarded in 2021, again, or potentially not funding, just depended on how much we had available. I think Guardianship Clinic, seeing that 15% would be partnership grant funds. They just seemed well funded, with or without our monies. But it looks like we do have some flexibility here to put funding their way. So. Any thoughts on staff recommendation of the 25% decrease from their 2021 award? Oh, Eric, I don't know if you said something. I saw your mouth move. I didn't hear anything.
Okay to me.
Okay. So that's 48,000 and then 22,000. All right, so that leaves us about 69,000. I'm revisiting the guardianship project for CCLS.
So put the 41 in there, I guess, because we've got it, right?
Yeah, is there any thoughts of maybe increase or keeping that recommendation?
So with the 28,574 remaining, are there higher scoring projects that the committee would like to more fully fund?
Good idea.
I'll sort this by largest to smallest. I'm going to scroll down the new funded. I think we're confirmed on that, either fully funding or keeping to the maximum range of the 120. San Luis Obispo, I think we were the committee wanted to increase the staff recommendation to 105. They're requesting 115. Does the committee want to increase this amount anymore, or?
What was the innovation points for on this one?
San Luis Obispo, it's I think it was the rural considerations. Just so I'm checking who had that one.
Was this ours?
Yeah, it was group 4. Sorry.
Let me look up my form. Yeah, okay.
YOLO already, or LISNIC already funding. Or do we want to look at the middle, kind of those 70 to 80 range projects to maybe see where we can distribute the additional 20?
What if we try to top off all the small ones?
Small in terms of
asks.
Oh, yeah, we can sort it that way too.
Just an idea.
Those are usually pretty, economical projects.
So domestic violence, Family Violence Law Center.
Do you mean that they're getting a lot of bang for their buck?
I mean that the budgets usually don't have a lot of fat in them. I don't know whether you get a lot of service units per dollar, but when there's only $25,000 in the budget, they usually don't have a lot, for like extra technology and weird stuff. It's usually just paying for staff.
Except they've got other money.
Yeah, this project is very well funded. 4% being partnership grant funds. I wouldn't necessarily know if the committee wants to put more money this way, or maybe one that, do you want to maybe sort by the percentage of partnership grant funds? Like if you can look at those higher amounts and see how those kind of consumer debt clinic, wasn't 100%, but we did, raise some of those issues, and it is seeking fifth year funding. YOLO, I think we're fully funding for meeting their request amount. Riverside.
If any of the committee members had something that was particularly fit that category of seed funding or related to unlawful detainers, given the current situation, where we could make sure that we fill any holes, if any of the committee members had, or staff had any wanted to point us in the direction there.
In terms of substantive areas, Will?
Yes.
Okay, so let me sort that way too, just so we can take unlawful detainer would be,
or housing, yeah. If there are any big cuts, I don't know. That looks pretty good.
I don't know if you want to maybe increase CLA SoCal's UD Norwalk maybe to 60,000, just because it will be housing. It's just, that's score. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, I think so.
That's a 13% cut. Do you want to look maybe geographically to see where the monies are being distributed? So we have 23,000 to spend. Any thoughts?
Maybe we should look geographically, look at the rural areas.
Yeah. Alameda, Imperial County, I know was one, and we increased their ask to 71,000. Do you want to potentially increase that to a little bit more, or keep that recommendation?
I wouldn't mind giving them their 74 that they asked for.
The committee.
Yes.
Yes, okay. All right. I'm gonna just scroll down if anyone can call out any. Okay, this is getting full funding. San Joaquin, also getting the top of the range.
What about San Bernardino, the Consumer Rights Clinic? That's okay. That's 5. Okay. What's the one that's 18% decrease?
That was the caregivers in small estates. do you potentially want to give more, allocate more monies to that project?
Yeah, that's a good one.
It's an 18, currently it's an 18% cut. Their ask is 138. So I don't know if you want to go a little bit higher. Oh, sorry, who?
85 or something like that.
Yeah.
82.
I think I heard Eric said 85 or 82.
And then just going back to San Luis Obispo, I know they were requesting 115 and we said 105. And they scored fairly high as well. Do we maybe want to increase that to like 110 and see where we are at the bottom of the balance?
Yeah, because they're just second year, right?
Yes. Okay, 10,000.
I wish I had this problem with my own money.
Yeah.
Santa Barbara scored a 70. They're the only one in Santa Barbara. We were granting them 109. Do we want to give a little bit more money just because that's the only project there? Or any thoughts?
On the, and we already discussed this one, but the small estates Riverside probate, because we were 100% of the funding, I think we were going to go talk to them before we considered any additional bump there. Was that my understanding?
No, I think we were going to give them this, but talk to them about it next year. I mean, we could give them a little bit more, I guess, if we wanted to.
More in terms of like 75 or like 80,000?
Well, I mean, they were, I don't know. I wouldn't, I mean, they didn't make a real impressive applications. That wouldn't be my first priority.
Right. Yeah, I agree with Eric. But that was just one where I saw a big cut. Even from last year's allocation, but they need to get it together.
Yeah.
So keeping that at the 70, maybe, so,
Yes.
okay. I'm just trying to think how else we can sort it to figure out another way to spend down this $10,000.
Can we look at the rest of the differences or the percentage cut?
This one?
I mean, just out of curiosity, could this money be used to support the outreach or webinar, whatever we want to try to do for evaluation?
I don't think
maybe
so.
cost associated.
No.
So the largest decreases was the guardianship project, small estates park, Riverside as well. Is there any thought to maybe increasing guardianship project by a little bit more, or keeping it? It's hard. I mean, I think, okay, let's see other ones. 20% consumer debt clinic, or Orange County Courthouse Guardianship Clinic was 20%. Remote Pro Save, I think that's 20 just because of the funding top of the range. Partnership to assist guardianship litigants was a 25% decrease. Does the committee want to bump up any of these numbers, or should I move a little bit up higher up in the list to see?
I mean, it looks like some of these have higher percentages of, or the recommendations are lower because the quality of the proposals were lower. So it doesn't make sense to bump those up. So maybe, yeah, look higher on the list.
Okay. Do you want to maybe bump this up to 36,000? We can round up the projects with ending with the 500. Okay.
Let's do that.
Let's see.
Which one was that now?
This will take them up to so JDC will be bumped up to 36,000. We're going to just round up to the nearest thousand and see what happens. 47,000 for the de facto and adoptive parent assistance. 61,000 for the family law settlement conference. Okay. 32,000 for the Orange County Courthouse Guardianship Clinic. Okay, we're at 8,000. let's see where.
Can we go back to the Santa Barbara project?
Yes.
Because I do feel like that's a an area that doesn't have you know, where Legal Aid of Santa Barbara is, you know, one of I think 2 legal aid programs that serve that area. And it seems like they're doing, where is it?
I know, sorry, I'm
Oh,
gonna
I see it. It's line 23, I think.
Yes, thank you.
They asked for 125.
125. We gave them about 115 last year, and I think that
Would the committee be comfortable going? Do we have enough to give them 115 again this year?
yes, we
That's
do.
reasonable.
Yes, is that a yes? So we have 2,000 left.
Are there any more stray 500s?
I know, I'm thinking as well.
About the San Diego UD project that we thought was so great.
I'm gonna go through San Diego. So they had an 11% cut. They were given.
Should we give them the balance?
Yeah.
So Elizabeth, just double checking, will there be like one or a few projects with like an odd amount, just so we can expend all of the funds?
That's fine.
So 72.
Or just put them all in there. Yeah. Ooh.
Okay. Now I will sort this by, how does the committee want it? Maybe we can do it by largest to smallest, and we just confirm that the committee's comfortable with these tentative funding recommendations. So the top, the projects that would receive the most funding are the newest projects, which is Bethzedek's Decedents Estate Self-Help Clinic and the Remote Pro Se Technology Initiative at 120. Oh, also including Sierra Leone's San Joaquin Housing Helpline at 120. And then 115 for Santa Barbara's Legal Resource Center Partnership, San Luis Obispo at 110 for their rental clinic. 108 for the Senior Citizens Legal Services Indigent Tenant Landlord Tenant Services. I'm gonna hide the staff recommendation for now. Oh, that didn't help. Sorry, I'm trying to view it all in one screen.
Maybe you can hide the substantive areas.
Okay.
For right now.
Yes, good idea. Where was I?
There we are.
All right, and then neighborhood legal services, stabilizing families, 100,000. San Diego Volunteer Lawyer Program for their Central Division Restraining Order Clinic, 93,000. Community Legal Aid SoCal's Compton Self-Help Economic Expansion Project at 92,000. Neighborhood Legal Services Chatsworth, 90,000. Inland County Legal Services Consumer Rights Clinic, 88,000. Legal Aid Society of San Bernardino, 85,000. LaFlez Torrance Self-Help Center, 84,000. NLS Pasadena Continuum Services, 81,000. LACPA Council for Justice, 80,000. Legal Aid of Marin Homelessness Prevention through MSCs, 80,000. Legal Aid Societies, Name Change and Gender Marker Change Self-Help Clinic, 75,000. Elder Law and Advocacy, Imperial County Unlawful Detainer Clinic, 74,000. Legal Aid Society of San Diego, 72,574. Riverside Legal Aid Small Estates Partnership at 70,000. CCLS Tulare County UD Workshop, 70,000. Lisnick's YOLO Consumer Clinic, 67,000. Legal Access Alameda Family Law Settlement Conference at 61,000. Legal Assistance for Seniors Partnership to Assist Limited Conservatorship Litigants, 60,000. CCLS's Tenant Landlord Housing Law Project at 60,000. Community Legal Aid SoCal UD Workshop at Norwalk, 60,000. Santa Clara University Alexander Law Center Consumer Debt Clinic, 50,000. Legal Assistance for Seniors Partnership to Assist Guardianship Litigants at 48,000. Public Law Centers De Facto and Adoptive Parent Assistance Project, 47,000. CCLS Guardianship Project at 41,000. JDC's Shriver Sash Self-Help Clinic at $36,000, Public Law Centers, Orange County Courthouse Guardianship Clinic at $32,000, Legal Access Alameda Family Law Day of Court at $25,000, CLA SoCal's Orange County Consumer Debt Workshop / Clinic, $23,000, Public Counsel Guardianship Clinic, $22,000, and then rounding off the allocations, Family Violence Law Center, $21,000. Confirming that the committee is okay with this tentative spread, and seeing if there's any follow-up questions or any information we'd like to relate to the applicants following this meeting.
And we did discuss that I would be contacting the executive director at Riverside Legal Aid to talk about grant writing generally.
I believe we'll also be sharing the rubric scores as well as some of the feedback from the review teams during this follow-up to share like the funding recommendations and their scores as well. So
could you sort by funding priority again really quickly? I'm just curious if we gave everybody a similar haircut on funding priority generally.
Yeah, so these are all the 20s. The larger haircuts are primarily because of those were the newer projects.
Right.
And then LISNIC, they're funded, so they're actually above 8% than what we gave them. So that's why that looks funky there.
Why are there percentages in there on the difference when there's?
So this was the new projects actually in relation to their ask amount. Everyone else was related to their 2021 allocation.
Okay.
Well, did you still want me to scroll down?
Yeah, just a little bit. Thank you. It looks like we were pretty consistent, especially when it comes to taking into account the rubric score, it looks like. Okay.
I think we started from a place of absolute consistency, and then we made reasoned variations from that when it was appropriate.
Yeah, so we have numbers on the board. I mentioned the follow-up that we'll do with the applicants. Just wanted to know if any committee members had any questions or concerns.
Chris, I was just wondering, Chris or Judge Jaskol, if now having seen the other funding priorities, if you felt it was still pretty in line, the applicants that you had reviewed didn't have any concerns now.
Not quite sure what you mean. You mean the fact that I gave mostly 3s?
Yeah, that was my understanding, that there was a desire to see what the other priorities were before really committing.
No, I mean, given what I understood to be what would be required to go above 3, I still feel comfortable with my scores.
Cool. All right. I just wanted to double check that, since I know consistency is difficult when it's a whole bunch of different people working to try and figure this out on the rubric.
All right, thanks.
I'm good, thank you.
Great. I think another thing we'll try to incorporate in the RFP next year is some of these sample responses that kind of exceeded expectations just for applicants. I know that was one thing we wanted to have, but we didn't necessarily have, if we do kind of utilize a rubric again for the review process. So we have that information. Yeah, Christine, is there anything else that we need to confirm more?
I don't think so. So what's next?
I think we need to vote on whether or not these are approved.
Oh, these don't actually, because they're tentative recommendations, they don't require a committee vote. That's at the June 18 meeting. So
okay.
Oh, all right.
Because staff still needs to follow up and to assure that these tentative recommendations, the grantees are able to do something with them and that sort of thing.
Excellent. I actually have a vote tally sheet for this, but we're going to leave it blank.
Use it next time.
Elizabeth, I didn't follow what you said. What are we going to do with these tentative recommendations? Are you saying?
Staff's following up with all the grantees if there are, any outstanding questions that were raised today or by the working groups. And then, if the amounts are lower than what the ask is, just confirming that, they will still be able to move forward with the project given the funding recommendations.
Sounds good.
And yeah, I think that was the bulk of our meeting today, what we were supposed to accomplish. I didn't want to end at 4, so I'm glad we're very early and able to come to a agreement with the tentative funding recommendations. I didn't have any. I don't think there's anything else for the agenda.
Will we be getting the response from the projects prior to the meeting?
Yes, prior to the June 18 meeting, I will be in contact. Well, and Justice Marie, I know there's a couple of follow-up questions that you both had, so I'll be in touch that after this meeting and then prior to the June 18 meeting.
And then at that meeting, if adjustments are needed, that's when we would make them.
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure we got it. Yeah, that sounds good.
It was actually very helpful that staff went through and did this provisional sort. Really saved us. It was very helpful to do that. So good job.
Thank you.
It was a great job by staff.
Here. Agreed.
Hey, yeah, we weren't sure how the systematic approach would take, but I think it helped provide like a talking point and then finding other reasons why granting additional funding and how to weight it. So I'm glad the committee was receptive to staff's recommendations. I'm going to stop sharing my screen then.
We're all just mesmerized by everything in that thing.
Many columns.
Okay, is there any other business we need to take care of today?
I was just curious, because it's all fresh in our mind, the rubric piece, do we have any evaluation form on the rubric already ready, or should we just take our own personal notes and then save them for that process later in the year?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I actually had our next meeting to do the debrief because that's when we're coming up with the final recommendations. If you have notes now, what I want to do is pull the committee up. I probably might make a survey or some sort of form or something just to get the feedback and your thoughts, by like early next week, just because you said it's still fresh too. So.
Yeah, my dad brain has not been great lately, so I'm trying to do things that's my head in fresh. So thank you.
It sounds like the evaluation piece is really going to be very important. Do you guys have thoughts about how that's going to work? Because I guess if we're going to have meaningful evaluations this year, I guess we have to get something going pretty quickly, right? In that regard.
We have had discussions with Melanie and Bonnie at the Judicial Council to work on the evaluation forms that grantees fill out, and so we have made some small changes in the past, but I think we're planning to meet with them in June to review the 2020 evaluations, and then make some further recommendations and work together to figure out how to improve that. So it is on our to-do list.
Is that a public meeting? I mean, I wouldn't. Would you mind if a commissioner or two participated in that?
Of course. We did have, I believe, Deborah Myers participate last year.
Yes.
And so, it is not a public meeting. It's just a meeting staff to staff, State Bar staff with Judicial Council staff. But, we would welcome your participation. And I think Bonnie might have some thoughts.
I just wanted to say, I think we were also thinking it might be helpful to do some training session or something like that for after reviewing the evaluations that we could, might be helpful for everyone to have a little bit of training and guidance. And there were some great evaluations, so it would be nice to be able to kind of note how people did those. So that was, I think, but we'll get together and talk in June about that.
Bonnie, did you have anything else kind of in response to the committee tentative funding recommendations or thoughts of this year's applicant pool?
No, I thought there were some great new applicants, and I really do appreciate State Bar staff's work in pulling together the recommendations. This is the shortest partnership grant meeting that I've seen in 22 years. I think it was really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to echo Eric's sentiments on the evaluations as well. That piece measuring how the public is actually responding and how many people are able to get the assistance that they seek is really important to me. I really thought it was deficient as in the applications that I reviewed, and I hope that piece is emphasized in whatever is going forward. I'm glad to contribute, because whether it's sending text message surveys or web surveys or whatever, especially for people who aren't able to get to the end, to try and evaluate how much we're doing how much this program helps to increase access to justice, as the 6121 says, or 6021.
The Judicial Council has been working really diligently for a couple of years at least on improving evaluation at self-help centers. And I think the goal is for us to coordinate what we're doing with what they're doing, so that information is more comprehensive. We can make more cross-platform comparisons, but the process is sort of going to take its shape from what happens with the Judicial Council. So we are really trying to coordinate and making sure that we step the same way they're stepping.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Does anybody else have anything they'd like to discuss before we adjourn? Right at 12:02, not 4 p.m. Great job, staff. Okay, then I guess we'll see everybody back on June 18th.
Thank you, everyone.
We're adjourned. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Nice weekend.
Now that we got it back.
Yes.
Really excited for this. Might go to the park.
Thanks, Christina.
Thank you. Very, very good. Thank you.